The Beothuk were an indigenous people of Canada who lived on the island of Newfoundland, particularly around Notre Dame and Bonavista Bay. They are believed to be descendants of an earlier group sometimes called the Little Passage people. Their distinct culture began forming around the year 1500 CE, likely representing the latest stage of a migration that started from Labrador to Newfoundland around 1 CE. Before them, their ancestors had gone through 3 cultural phases, each lasting roughly 500 years. Estimating their population at the time of European contact is tricky. Their numbers were already declining as their territory shrank, and European historical accounts tend to be unreliable, often shaped by ethnocentric biases. Some early scholars from the 19th and 20th centuries estimated around 2,000 Beothuk were living in Newfoundland when Europeans arrived in the 15th century. However, more recent studies suggest their population may have been closer to 500 to 700. Based on the land's ability to support them, a more reasonable estimate is between 1,000 and 1,500 people. They lived in small, independent family groups, typically ranging from 30 to 55 individuals. The Beothuk relied on hunting and fishing, moving between the coasts and the island's interior. They were organized into bands of around 35 to 50 people, with leadership based on consensus rather than rigid hierarchy. Leadership was often situational. A skilled hunter might take charge during a caribou hunt, while an older, wise woman could provide guidance when dealing with the Europeans who had arrived across the ocean. Like many other hunter-gatherer societies, the Beothuk had band leaders, but didn't seem to have formal chiefs in the strict anthropological sense. They lived in conical dwellings called mamatiques, which they fortified for winter. These structures were made by arranging poles in a circle, tying them at the top, and covering them with birch bark. Inside, the floors had dug-out hollows for sleeping, and a fireplace was placed at the center to provide warmth. During the summer, the Beothuk lived in bark, or skin-covered tents, while in winter, they stayed in semi-subterranean houses that helped shield them from the cold. They were mainly a coastal people, living in small bands spread throughout Newfoundland's bays. Their diet relied heavily on the sea, as they collected shellfish, harpooned seals and whales, and fished for cod and other species. While they occasionally traveled inland to hunt caribou, there's no strong evidence that they spent entire winters in the interior until after European contact. For hunting, the Beothuk used bows and arrows, harpoons, and spears, often launching their hunts from sturdy bark canoes. These canoes were made of caribou or sealskin, with their bows reinforced using spruce bark. They resembled kayaks, measuring about 15 feet long and 2.5 feet wide, with enough space to carry children, dogs, and supplies. To craft their tools and weapons, the Beothuk sought out high-quality stone, specifically grey-green and blue-green chert, which they used for making arrow and lance points. The best source of this chert in eastern Notre Dame Bay appears to be glacial boulders left behind from the last ice age, though archaeologists have yet to pinpoint their exact locations. Nevertheless, pre-contact Beothuk, such as those at Boyd's Cove, would have relied on a steady supply of this raw material for hunting, particularly for caribou. The Beothuk had a unique diet and food preservation methods. They are known to have made a type of pudding using tree sap and dried yolk from the eggs of the great auk. They also stored surplus food to get through the harsh winters, trapped fur-bearing animals, and used their pelts to make warm clothing. Interestingly, they wore the fur side against their skin, which helped trap air and retain body heat. One of their most distinctive practices was covering their bodies, clothes, and tools with a red paint mixture made from powdered ochre and grease. This may have had both practical and spiritual purposes, perhaps, for warmth, or as part of their beliefs. When Europeans first saw this, they referred to them as Red Indians, a term that was later incorrectly applied to many indigenous peoples across North America. As part of the Algonquian language group, the Beothuk may have shared similar religious beliefs and stories with other Algonquian-speaking peoples. A Beothuk woman named Ubi, who was taken captive, once said that her people worshipped the sun and moon. Another Beothuk, Shanawdithit, who documented her people's history, described a belief in a spirit world that included a supreme spirit, possibly a creator, as well as dark spirits or monsters. In the early 1800s, A Beothuk woman named Shanawdithit helped record her language. She had been captured by English fishers in 1819 and was later taken to an Anglican missionary. There, some of the Beothuk vocabulary was written down. European word lists from the 18th and 19th centuries confirm that the Beothuk language was part of the Algonquian family, though sadly, much of it has since been lost. The Beothuk were the first indigenous people to come into contact with Europeans, first encountering Viking explorers and later European whalers and fishermen. Around 1000 CE, Norse explorers led by Leif Erikson arrived in northern Newfoundland, where they met indigenous groups. These could have been ancestors of the Beothuk or possibly Dorset people from Labrador and Newfoundland. The Norse referred to them as Skrælings, a term they used for all indigenous peoples they encountered. Later, in 1497, when Italian explorer John Cabot arrived under the sponsorship of King Henry VII, European contact became more frequent. The Beothuk likely had violent encounters with the Vikings between 800 and 1000 CE, which may have contributed to their strategy of avoiding European newcomers whenever possible. As more Europeans arrived and established settlements, the Beothuk retreated further inland. They would occasionally return to their former coastal camps, but mainly to scavenge metal objects, tools, and building materials left behind by European fishermen who used the area to dry and cure their catch before sailing back to Europe. Some Beothuk were likely captured by these early European arrivals. One of the earliest references to the Beothuk in European records comes from 1501, just a few years after Cabot's expedition. An Italian diplomat, Alberto Cantino, wrote about seeing native captives in Lisbon, who may have been Beothuk. According to his account, about 50 men and women had been forcibly taken and presented to the king. Cantino described them as tall, with green eyes, and physically strong, believing they would make good slaves. However, this assumption proved wrong, as nearly all of them died most during the journey, and the rest soon after arriving in Europe. There is no definitive proof that these captives were Beothuk, but if they were, they may have been among the first indigenous people displayed in Europe as representatives of the New World. Sadly, their fate foreshadowed what would eventually happen to the entire Beothuk nation. During the 1600s, the Beothuk frequently encountered European fishermen who set up temporary camps along the Newfoundland coast each summer. Since the Europeans left in the fall, the Beothuk would come afterward, collecting metal scraps such as nails, fish hooks, and bits of iron. They repurposed these materials into arrowheads, blades, and other tools. Unlike many other indigenous groups, they did not engage in direct trade with Europeans, but instead obtained European goods by scavenging what was left behind. By the early 17th century, there was little evidence of trade between the Beothuk and European settlers, or fishermen. One rare documented encounter occurred in 1612 when John Guy, an English colonizer, met a group of Beothuk at the bottom of Trinity Bay. The Beothuk seemed to prefer a silent barter system. They set up poles with furs and shells, likely expecting Guy to leave behind whatever he deemed a fair trade. This may have been how the Beothuk interacted with Europeans for over a century. However, for the next 100 years after this event, they largely disappeared from historical records, most likely because they were avoiding Europeans while still collecting metal objects from abandoned fishing sites. Despite occasional peaceful interactions like Guy's meeting, relations between the Beothuk and Europeans were usually hostile. Both groups competed for the same natural resources: fish, seals, and birds along the coast, and caribou in the interior. European fur trappers disrupted Beothuk hunting grounds, ransacked their camps, and took their supplies. In response, the Beothuk stole metal from traps and raided European homes and shelters, sometimes ambushing settlers. These conflicts escalated into violence, and since the settlers had firearms while the Beothuk did not seem interested in adopting them, the Europeans usually had the upper hand in both hunting and warfare. By the 1700s, as European settlements became permanent, the Beothuk way of life was dramatically disrupted. The French established themselves in Placentia, while the English occupied areas from Conception Bay to Bonavista Bay. To avoid these growing colonies, the Beothuk retreated deeper inland, isolating themselves from European contact. But this withdrawal came at a cost. With the English population increasing in Newfoundland, White fur trappers ventured further into the interior, directly competing with the Beothuk for resources. At the same time, the Beothuk lost access to the bays where they had traditionally fished, forcing them into a more precarious existence. Their troubles didn't stop there. The Micmac presence in the southwestern and southern parts of the island further restricted Beothuk movement. Meanwhile, the Strait of Belle Isle region, once part of their territory, had long been taken over first by Basque whalers in the mid-1500s, then by Inuit from the north, and later by French entrepreneurs looking for fish and seals. By the early 1800s, the Beothuk population had dwindled significantly, confined to the Exploits River system where food and shelter were scarce. By the mid-18th century, their world was collapsing. With little access to coastal resources, the Beothuk became increasingly dependent on caribou and beaver from the interior. But caribou numbers declined due to overhunting, making survival even harder. Desperate, the Beothuk risked secret trips to the coast in search of fish, seals, and seabirds, their traditional food sources. There, they clashed with European settlers, who viewed them as thieves, rather than a displaced people struggling to survive. These conflicts often ended in violence. With their traditional lands taken over and their food sources vanishing, the Beothuk faced starvation. Many historians also believe that diseases brought by Europeans, especially tuberculosis, contributed to their decline. At this point, their numbers were so reduced that they could no longer sustain themselves as a distinct people. Some were forcibly captured by Europeans, while others were killed in conflicts. Their way of life was disappearing, and so were they. Throughout much of the 18th century, British officials in Newfoundland paid little attention to the Beothuk. Their presence was not considered a major concern, as most settlers and migratory fishermen had little direct contact with them. However, this began to change in 1768, when the naval governor, Hugh Palliser, made an attempt to establish peaceful relations. He dispatched Lieutenant John Cartwright up the Exploits River to seek out the Beothuk and encourage them to engage with the English. While Cartwright documented signs of habitation, including numerous dwellings, he never actually encountered any of the Beothuk themselves. Palliser's interest in the Beothuk reflected a broader shift in attitudes taking place in the Atlantic world. By the late 18th century, a growing humanitarian movement had begun to take shape that questioned the excesses of Western civilization, sought to end slavery, opposed judicial torture, and expressed concern for the plight of indigenous peoples. Palliser himself was also worried about the Inuit of Labrador and requested that Moravian missionaries come to the region to help prevent conflicts between them and European whalers and fishermen. However, while this newfound concern for the Beothuk was well-intentioned, it ultimately did little to improve their situation. In 1792, Captain George C. Pulling attempted to bring attention to the violence committed against the Beothuk by surveying English settlers on the northeast coast and documenting their accounts of atrocities. He reportedly submitted his findings to a parliamentary committee, but his efforts led to no meaningful action. Over the next several years, a succession of Newfoundland governors, starting with William Waldegrave in 1797, issued proclamations forbidding attacks on the Beothuk, and even offered rewards for those who could establish peaceful contact. Despite these official measures, no real progress was made. The most significant attempt to communicate with the Beothuk came in the winter of 1811. Governor John Duckworth sent Lieutenant David Buchan on an expedition up the Exploits River, accompanied by a small group of Marines. Buchan's party managed to locate a large Beothuk encampment, but the reaction of the Beothuk was one of terror. Given their history of mistreatment by Europeans, they had every reason to be afraid. Buchan, hoping to prove his peaceful intentions, spent some time with them before deciding to return down the river to collect more gifts. To maintain trust, he left 2 of his men behind as hostages. This decision proved disastrous. When Buchan returned, he found the Beothuk camp abandoned and his 2 men dead. The exact circumstances of their deaths remain unknown, but it is likely that the Beothuk, having suffered years of violence and displacement, saw little reason to trust outsiders. By this time, their numbers had dwindled so much that only a radical shift in relations zone that never materialized could have changed their fate. In the years following the ill-fated Buchan expedition, the Beothuk found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. European settlers continued to push deeper into what had once been Beothuk territory, cutting off their access to vital resources. Faced with dwindling supplies, the Beothuk resorted to raiding European fishing stations and fur trading outposts, scavenging what they could to survive. These acts of desperation, however, only fueled settler hostility. Retaliation was swift and brutal, particularly at the hands of men like John Peyton Sr., a Newfoundland entrepreneur notorious for his violent retribution against any Beothuk who dared take his property. In the late winter of 1819, tensions came to a head when a group of Beothuk cut loose a boat loaded with goods belonging to Peyton. Enraged, Peyton gathered a party of men and launched an attack on a Beothuk settlement at Red Indian Lake. In the assault, a young Beothuk woman named Shanawdithit witnessed her husband's murder before being taken captive. Her captors renamed her Mary March after the month in which she was seized, and she was paraded through Twillingate and St. John's, where she met the governor. Although he ordered her return to her people, efforts to reunite her with the Beothuk failed. By then, her community had all but disappeared. Shanawdithit herself succumbed to illness aboard David Buchan's vessel in January 1820, yet another tragic victim of the slow collapse of her people. By the early 1820s, the Beothuk were on the verge of extinction. Their numbers had been so reduced that they could no longer sustain themselves, and their avoidance of European contact meant they had no allies among the settlers. In 1823, 3 starving Beothuk women, too weak to continue their struggle for survival, surrendered themselves to a settler in Notre Dame Bay. They were taken to St. John's under the supervision of John Peyton Jr., the son of the very man responsible for Shanawdithit's capture. Once again, Lieutenant Buchan attempted to return them to their homeland, but 2 of the women died before this could happen. The sole survivor was a young woman named Shanawdithit. Shanawdithit lived for 5 years in Peyton Jr.'s household, during which time it is likely that the last remnants of her people perished. In 1828, she was taken to St. John's, where she came under the care of William Cormac, an explorer who had previously tried and failed to locate the Beothuk. Recognizing that she might be the last of her kind, Cormac carefully recorded her recollections of Beothuk life. Through her, a glimpse of the lost world of the Beothuk was preserved. She produced a series of drawings that detailed her people's customs, hunting techniques, and the tragic encounters with Europeans that had led to their decline. These drawings remain one of the most valuable sources of information about the Beothuk. Despite her resilience, Shanawdithit was in poor health. Years of malnutrition and exposure to European diseases had taken their toll, and in June 1829, she died in St. John's. With her passing, the Beothuk as a distinct people were no more. Their disappearance remains one of the great tragedies of North American history. While some have described the Beothuk's fate as the result of centuries of genocide, the reality is more complex. Their extinction was not due to systematic extermination, but rather a confluence of historical, ecological, and economic factors. The island's environment made large-scale sustenance difficult, and the Beothuk's isolationist approach left them without crucial allies among other indigenous groups or European settlers. Competition for resources, combined with displacement, starvation, and disease, ultimately sealed their fate. For nearly 2 centuries, the story of the Beothuk has been told as one of absolute extinction. Western historical accounts have long maintained that the Beothuk, devastated by European encroachment, disease, and violent conflicts, were completely wiped out. The death of Shanawdithit in 1829 has often been seen as the final chapter in their history, marking the tragic end of an entire people. William Cormac, the Scottish merchant and naturalist who recorded much of what we know about Beothuk culture through his conversations with Shanawdithit, likely believed she was the last of her kind. His writings helped solidify the idea that the Beothuk had vanished without a trace. However, modern historical approaches and indigenous oral histories challenge this rigid narrative. The Mi'kmaq, one of the First Nations with deep historical ties to Newfoundland, have long argued that the Beothuk were never truly extinct. According to their oral traditions, many Beothuk fled into the interior or sought refuge among indigenous nations on the mainland as European settlements expanded. These stories suggest that rather than being wiped out entirely, the Beothuk may have assimilated into other indigenous communities, where their bloodlines and cultural elements survived. Some theories go even further. There are suggestions that the Beothuk may have intermarried with European groups much earlier than previously thought, perhaps even with Norse settlers who briefly occupied parts of Newfoundland around the year 1000. This speculation has led to the idea that Beothuk ancestry might still be present in Iceland or other regions linked to Viking exploration. While no conclusive genetic evidence has confirmed this, the idea persists as a counterpoint to the widely accepted notion of Beothuk extinction. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence suggesting Beothuk survival came in 1910, when an elderly Indigenous woman named Santu Toni shared her story with American anthropologist Frank Speck. Santu, then 75 years old, claimed she was the daughter of a Mi'kmaq mother and a Beothuk father. More remarkably, she recorded a song in the Beothuk language, which she said had been taught to her by her father. If her claims were true, this would mean that Beothuk individuals had survived well beyond the death of Shanawdithit in 1829. Speck, eager to document any remaining traces of Beothuk culture, carefully recorded the song and attempted to transcribe its words. While some linguists have debated the accuracy of the transcription, the recording itself remains an important cultural artifact. In recent years, modern technology has allowed researchers to enhance and analyze the recording, and Indigenous groups have even revived the song, incorporating it into ceremonies celebrating their shared heritage. Despite this evidence, the fate of the Beothuk remains an open question. The dominant historical record, based largely on European sources, still views them as a lost people.